Nebraska Territory, 1874. The small frontier town of Riverbed huddled against the vast expanse of prairie like a child clinging to its mother's skirts. Dusty storefronts lined the single muddy street, and at the end stood a solitary homestead, a modest two-story house with a barn beside it, surrounded by fencing that enclosed nearly 40 acres of land. This was the home of Daniel Vance, a young rancher whose 26 years had taught him one undeniable truth. A man survived the frontier alone or not at all. Daniel paused in mending his fence, watching a lone stagecoach rumble down the road toward town. Another fool coming to test their mettle against this unforgiving land, he thought. He'd seen too many broken souls pack up and head east again, defeated by drought, disease, or the sheer, crushing loneliness. His own parents hadn't survived their third winter here, both taken by influenza within days of each other when he was just 17. He'd buried them himself, then continued the work they'd started. Alone, the way it had to be. She will be arriving today, Mrs. Peterson had reminded him yesterday at the general store, her eyes twinkling with meddlesome delight. Your bride. On the afternoon stage, Daniel had merely nodded, already regretting the entire arrangement. What madness had possessed him to send away for a mail-order bride? The ranch was growing, and he needed help, that was all. A business arrangement, nothing more. Love was a luxury the frontier didn't permit. His parents had loved each other deeply, and what good had it done them in the end? All love brought was doubled pain when death inevitably came. He drove another nail into the fence post with unnecessary force. The girl would understand their arrangement, or she could return east on the next stage. He had no room for sentiment in his life, only survival. The stage disappeared behind the buildings of town, and Daniel returned to his work. He had another hour before he needed to head in to meet her. His bride. The words still felt foreign in his mind, like trying to speak a language he'd only read in books. The April sun beat down on his back as he hammered the final nail. A good omen, perhaps, the weather holding fair after weeks of unpredictable spring storms. Not that Daniel believed in omens. He believed in what his hands could build, what his back could carry, what his mind could plan for. Nothing else. Yet as he cleaned up and prepared to ride into town, a strange fluttering took residence in his stomach. Nerves, he told himself. Nothing more. Abigail Armstrong clutched her small carpet bag with white-knuckled hands as the stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of what appeared to be Riverbed's only hotel. At 20 years old, she had never traveled farther than 10 miles from her Philadelphia home before embarking on this desperate journey west. Her honey-blonde hair was coming loose from its pins after 3 days of rough travel, and her blue calico traveling dress bore the dust and wrinkles of the road. She knew she must look a fright, certainly not the presentable bride her soon-to-be husband would be expecting. Daniel Vance. The name echoed in her mind like a prayer, or perhaps a warning. His letters had been brief, practical, detailing the ranch, the work required, the accommodations. Not once had he mentioned affection or companionship. But then, she hadn't come west seeking romance. She had come seeking escape. Riverbed. End of the line, the driver called, opening the door. Abigail hesitated, then accepted the driver's hand down. The small town sprawled before her, a single muddy street lined with wooden buildings, some still sporting rough-hewn logs. Nothing like the brick and cobblestone of Philadelphia. You waiting for someone, miss? The driver asked, unloading the luggage from the top of the stage. Yes, she replied, her voice barely audible over the sound of horses and the bustle of the few people moving about the street. My husband-to-be. The word caught in her throat. Just 3 months ago, she had been planning to wed James Welton, son of her father's business partner. Then she had discovered the truth, his gambling debts, his violent temper, and worst of all, his involvement in her brother's death. When her parents refused to believe her accusations, insisting the wedding proceed, she had slipped away in the night with what little money she could gather. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like providence. Rancher seeks bride. Must be hard-working, honest, and willing to build a life in Nebraska Territory. Abigail scanned the street, searching for the man who matched the brief description he had provided. Tall, brown hair, will be wearing a brown hat. Not much to go on, but her eyes locked with a young man approaching from the livery. He couldn't have been much older than she was, perhaps 25 or 26. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew his own strength. His face was sun-bronzed but clean-shaven, his features strikingly handsome, with a strong jaw and deep-set eyes. Not the grizzled, weather-beaten homesteader she had imagined. As he drew closer, she noted the quality of his clothing. Simple but well-maintained. A brown Stetson sat atop his head, and recognition flashed in his eyes as they settled on her. "Miss Armstrong?" he asked, his voice deep but not rough. Abigail nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Fear surged through her. What if he was like James, hiding cruelty beneath a pleasant exterior? What if she had traded one prison for another, more isolated one? The journey west had given her too much time to imagine worst-case scenarios. "I'm Daniel Vance," he said, extending a hand and then awkwardly withdrawing it, seeming unsure of the proper greeting for a woman who was technically his betrothed yet still a stranger. "It's good to meet you, Mr. Vance," she managed, her voice small. She knew her fear must be evident in her eyes. The widow who ran the boarding house in the last town had warned her how dangerous the frontier could be for a woman alone. Especially the pretty ones, she'd cautioned. Daniel's expression softened slightly as he noticed her trembling hands and wide eyes. "You're safe now," he said simply. "I'll protect you." Then, as if embarrassed by the declaration, he added more practically, "The ranch is secure. Good fencing, solid house. No need to worry." But it wasn't wild animals or exposure that frightened Abigail most. It was the man standing before her, the stranger she had agreed to marry, whose homestead was miles from town, whose life she would now share with no easy escape should he prove to be a monster. Daniel seemed to read some of this in her expression. He took a step back, giving her space. "We should get your things to the ranch before dark. Pastor Miller is expecting us tomorrow for the ceremony, if that suits you." His tone was matter-of-fact, businesslike. "Unless you need rest first. We could arrange a room here for tonight." The unexpected consideration caught Abigail off guard. I would prefer to see where I'll be living, if that's acceptable." Daniel nodded once, then reached for her bag. "Is this all you brought?" "Yes," she admitted. "I traveled light." She didn't add that she'd fled Philadelphia with only what she could carry, leaving behind the trappings of her former life. "Sensible," he commented, and for the first time, a hint of approval colored his tone. He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. "The ride's about 40 minutes. Not too rough, but not a city carriage either." As they walked to the wagon, Abigail felt the eyes of the townspeople following them. A young woman emerging from the general store stared openly, while an older man, smoking a pipe on the porch of what appeared to be a saloon, tipped his hat. "Word travels fast in small towns," Daniel explained, helping her onto the wagon seat. "They've known I sent for a bride for weeks now." Abigail's cheeks flushed. "I suppose I'm something of a curiosity. Most women who come out this way are," he agreed, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. "Not many choose this life willingly." As they pulled away from town, silence settled between them. Not comfortable, but not entirely strained either. Abigail studied her future husband's profile, noting the straight nose, the firm set of his mouth, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for potential threats. "The ranch," Daniel said eventually, "it's not fancy, but it's solid. Good water source, fertile soil. The cattle herd's small but growing." "How long have you been there?" she asked, grasping at conversation. 9 years. Came with my parents when I was 17. His tone flattened. "They passed that first winter. I've run it since." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly, glimpsing the pain he tried to hide. Daniel merely nodded, then added, "That's the frontier. Takes more than it gives, most times." The bleakness of his assessment sent a chill through Abigail despite the warm spring air. What kind of life awaited her with a man who viewed the world through such a lens? Yet there was something compelling about his straightforward manner, the absence of false charm that had masked James's true nature. As they crested a small rise, the landscape opened before them. Rolling prairie stretching to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of trees. And there, nestled in a small valley where a creek cut through the land, sat a homestead. A 2-story wooden house with a covered porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed, genuinely surprised by the orderliness of the property. Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's a good piece of land," he said finally. Needs work? Always does, but it's worth the effort. As they approached, Abigail could see the care that had gone into the place. The straight fence lines, the well-tended garden plot beside the house, the fresh coat of whitewash on the buildings. This was not the home of a man who merely survived. This was the home of a man who built for the future. They pulled up before the house, and Daniel helped her down from the wagon. For a moment, his hands lingered at her waist, and their eyes met. Something passed between them, not romance, perhaps, but recognition of the strangeness of their situation. I made up the spare room for you, he said, breaking the moment. Until after tomorrow's ceremony. Seemed proper. The consideration touched her. Thank you, Mr. Vance. Daniel, he corrected gently. If we're to be married tomorrow, you should use my given name. Daniel, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. And I'm Abigail, though most call me Abby. He nodded, then gestured toward the house. I'll show you around, then tend to the horses. Supper won't be fancy, I'm no cook. I can cook, she offered quickly, eager to establish her usefulness. If you show me what supplies you have. A flicker of surprise crossed his features. You don't need to start work today. You've had a long journey. I'd prefer to keep busy, she admitted. And cooking isn't work to me. It's comforting. Understanding dawned in his eyes. All right then, let me show you the house first. The tour revealed a home that was far more comfortable than Abigail had expected. Simple furniture, handcrafted but well-made, filled the rooms. The kitchen was equipped with a good cast-iron stove and ample supplies. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a small sitting area spoke of Daniel's aspirations beyond mere survival. This will be our room, he said matter-of-factly, opening the door to the larger bedroom. A sturdy bed with a patchwork quilt dominated the space, and a rocking chair sat by the window that overlooked the valley. I made the furniture, he added, a hint of pride in his voice. Abigail ran her hand along the smooth wood of the dresser. It's beautiful work. My father was a carpenter before we came west, Daniel explained. He taught me. In that moment, Abigail saw beyond the stoic rancher to the boy who had lost his parents too young, who had carried on their dream alone, who had built this place from grief and determination. Her fear began to recede, replaced by something else. Not quite trust, but perhaps the seed of it. I'll show you your room for tonight, Daniel continued, leading her across the hall. The spare room was smaller but no less comfortable, with a single bed, a small dresser, and a washstand complete with a pitcher and bowl. I'll bring up water for washing, Daniel offered. Take your time settling in. I need to see to the animals. Left alone, Abigail sank onto the bed, the events of the day, of the past months, finally catching up to her. She was here, in Nebraska Territory, about to marry a stranger. Yet something about Daniel Vance's quiet competence, his straightforward manner, gave her hope that perhaps she hadn't made a terrible mistake after all. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table and hanging her second dress, a simple blue cotton, in the small closet. Her wedding dress, such as it was, remained folded in the carpet bag. Not the elaborate silk and lace she'd once expected to wear, but a modest cream-colored dress with a bit of eyelet trim at the collar and cuffs. By the time Daniel returned with water, Abigail had composed herself. She washed the travel dust from her face and hands, repinned her hair, and changed into her other everyday dress before heading downstairs to prepare supper. In the kitchen, she discovered ample supplies: flour, sugar, salt, coffee, and a smokehouse out back with ham and bacon. The garden was just beginning to produce early spring vegetables. When Daniel came in from the barn, he found her at the stove, frying ham and potatoes, a batch of biscuits already in the oven. Smells good, he said, washing up at the sink. Better than I've managed in a long while. You haven't hired help? She asked, curious about how he'd managed alone. For the ranch work, sometimes. Not in the house. He dried his hands on a towel. Didn't seem right having another woman here before. He trailed off, seemingly uncomfortable. Before your wife arrived, Abigail finished for him, understanding his meaning. Daniel nodded, then set about setting the table without being asked. The simple domesticity of the moment struck Abigail. This was to be her life now. These everyday routines with this man she barely knew. They ate mostly in silence, though not an uncomfortable one. Daniel complimented her cooking, and Abigail asked a few questions about the ranch, how many cattle he kept, what crops he grew, the challenges of the coming seasons. Winter's the hardest, he explained. We can get cut off for weeks when the snow's deep. Need to be prepared. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, Abigail assured him, though the latter wasn't entirely true. The thought of being snowed in, miles from town, was daunting. Daniel studied her for a moment. Why did you come west, Abigail? A woman like you, educated, well-spoken, could have found a husband back east easily enough. The direct question caught her off guard. She hadn't planned to share her past so soon, but something in Daniel's straightforward manner demanded honesty. I needed to leave Philadelphia, she said carefully. My parents arranged a marriage to a man who... She hesitated, then continued. A man who was not what he appeared to be. When I discovered his true character and tried to break the engagement, my family refused to listen. They insisted the marriage would proceed. Daniel's expression hardened. So you ran? Yes, she admitted. It wasn't brave, perhaps, but it was necessary. Brave enough, he countered unexpectedly. Takes courage to leave everything familiar behind, to journey into the unknown rather than submit to a fate you know is wrong. His understanding, so simply stated, brought tears to Abigail's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to appear weak. The past is past, Daniel continued. Out here, it's what you build going forward that matters. Abigail nodded, grateful he didn't press for details she wasn't ready to share, about James's brutality, about her brother's suspicious accident after confronting James about his gambling debts. What about you? She asked, turning the conversation. Why seek a bride by advertisement? Daniel's jaw tightened. Practical reasons. The ranch is growing. Too much work for one person. He paused, then added with unexpected candor. And the silence gets heavy after a while. That simple admission, the acknowledgement of loneliness, revealed more about Daniel Vance than perhaps he intended. This was a man who had walled himself off from connection, who viewed marriage as a practical arrangement rather than an emotional one. Yet that hint of vulnerability suggested depths beneath the stoic exterior. After supper, they sat on the front porch as twilight painted the prairie in shades of gold and purple. Crickets began their evening chorus, and in the distance, coyotes called to one another. It's beautiful, Abigail murmured, breathing in the clean air scented with grass and wildflowers. It is, Daniel agreed, his voice softening. Easy to forget that when you're fighting it every day, the drought, the storms, the cold. But then there are moments like this. They sat in companionable silence until darkness fully descended. Daniel lit a lamp in the sitting room, then excused himself to check the livestock one final time before retiring. Rest well, he said as he showed her back to her room for the night. Pastor Miller expects us at 10 tomorrow, if that suits you. It does, Abigail replied, suddenly nervous at the reminder of tomorrow's ceremony. Daniel seemed to sense her unease. This arrangement, he said carefully. I know it's not what most women dream of, but I promise you this, Abigail. I'll provide for you, protect you, and treat you with respect. I won't make promises about things I'm not sure I can give, but those things I can promise. The honesty of his statement was more reassuring than false declarations of instant affection would have been. Thank you, Daniel, she said softly. Good night. Alone in her room, Abigail knelt beside the bed and prayed, for courage, for wisdom, and perhaps, if God was willing, for the possibility of happiness in this new life. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Daniel Vance, and the frightened girl who had fled Philadelphia would be left behind forever. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and mild. Daniel had been up since before sunrise, completing chores and preparing the wagon. He'd polished his boots, put on his one good shirt, and even trimmed his hair as best he could. As he waited in the sitting room, anxiety gnawed at him. He had built his life around self-sufficiency, around needing no one. Now he was voluntarily binding himself to another person, creating a vulnerability he'd sworn to avoid after his parents' deaths. When Abigail descended the stairs in her cream-colored dress, her honey-blonde hair arranged simply but elegantly beneath a small hat adorned with fabric flowers, Daniel felt something shift inside him. She wasn't just a practical solution to the ranch's needs. She was a woman of courage and grace who had chosen to trust him with her future. You look nice, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Thank you, she replied, a blush coloring her cheeks. So do you. The drive to town passed quickly, both of them caught in their own thoughts. The small white church at the edge of Riverbed welcomed them, Pastor Miller waiting on the steps with his wife beside him as witness. The ceremony was brief and simple. They exchanged plain gold bands that Daniel had purchased months ago in a moment of optimism he'd later questioned. When Pastor Miller pronounced them man and wife, Daniel hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a chaste kiss on Abigail's lips, their first physical contact beyond helping her in and out of the wagon. Her lips were soft, yielding for just a moment before they both pulled away, equally uncertain in this new territory. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Vance," Pastor Miller said warmly. "May God bless your union with prosperity and joy." They signed the marriage certificate, accepted the pastor and his wife's good wishes, then found themselves back in the wagon, husband and wife-in-law, if not yet in truth. "Would you like to visit the general store before we return home?" Daniel asked, using the word deliberately. Home. No longer his alone, but theirs. Abigail nodded, seeming grateful for the mundane errand to ease the strangeness of their new situation. At the store, Daniel introduced her to Mrs. Peterson, the proprietor's wife, who beamed with approval. "Such a lovely bride," she enthused, patting Abigail's hand. "Daniel's been needing a good woman to bring some softness to that ranch. All work and no heart isn't good for a young man." Daniel cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the personal observation. "We need supplies, Mrs. Peterson, and perhaps some fabric, if you have any that might suit Mrs. Vance." The title felt strange on his tongue. Mrs. Vance, a name that had belonged only to his mother in his memory. Abigail selected a bolt of calico and some thread, along with a few household items she thought might be useful. Daniel added their usual supplies: coffee, sugar, ammunition, and paid for the purchases. As they were preparing to leave, the door opened, admitting Thomas Blackridge, owner of the largest ranch in the territory and, in Daniel's estimation, the most arrogant man west of the Mississippi. Blackridge's eyes immediately fell on Abigail, a predatory gleam lighting them as he removed his hat. "Well now, what have we here? New blood in our little backwater." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "My wife, Abigail Vance. We were just married this morning." Blackridge's eyebrows rose. "Wife? Vance, you dark horse. Didn't know you had it in you to attract such a beauty." He extended his hand to Abigail. "Thomas Blackridge, ma'am. Largest cattle operation in 3 territories. If you ever tire of scratching out a living on Vance's little homestead, my door is always open." The implication in his tone made Daniel's fists clench, but before he could respond, Abigail spoke, her voice cool but perfectly polite. "How kind of you to congratulate us on our marriage, Mr. Blackridge. I'm very happy with my new home and husband." She placed a deliberate emphasis on the word husband, while ignoring his outstretched hand. Blackridge's smile faltered, then returned with a harder edge. "Of course. My felicitations to you both." He turned to Daniel, his voice lowering. "Just remember, Vance, that water rights dispute isn't settled. Judge Wilson may have ruled in your favor for now, but the territorial court might see things differently." "The creek runs through my property," Daniel replied evenly. "The law's clear enough. We'll see." Blackridge replied with a final glance at Abigail. "Good day, Mrs. Vance." After he departed, Mrs. Peterson shook her head. That man never did learn to take no for an answer. Been trying to push smaller ranchers out since he arrived 5 years ago. What water dispute was he referring to? Abigail asked as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. Daniel sighed. "The creek that runs through our property also feeds his southern pastures. He wants exclusive rights to it, which would essentially force me to sell the ranch. No water, no cattle, no crops." "Can he do that?" "Not legally. The local judge already ruled in my favor because the creek originates on my land. But Blackridge has money and connections in the territorial capital. He's appealing the decision." Abigail's brow furrowed. Would losing the water rights truly mean losing the ranch? "Yes," Daniel admitted. "Without that creek, the land's value drops to almost nothing." The ride home was quieter after this revelation. Daniel cursed himself for allowing Blackridge's threats to cast a shadow over their wedding day. This was precisely why he'd avoided attachments. Every connection was a potential weakness, another thing to lose. But as they approached the ranch, Abigail surprised him. "We won't let him take it," she said firmly. "This is our home now. Our home." The simple declaration kindled an unexpected warmth in Daniel's chest. He'd been so long alone that the concept of our anything felt foreign, yet not unwelcome. That evening, they shared a wedding supper that Abigail prepared while Daniel finished the day's chores. She'd somehow transformed their basic provisions into a feast: fried chicken, biscuits with honey, fresh vegetables from the garden, and an apple pie that rivaled any Daniel had tasted. "My mother taught me to cook," she explained when he complimented the meal. She believed it was an essential skill for a woman, regardless of station. "She taught you well," Daniel replied, helping himself to a second piece of pie. "My mother was the same, practical above all else. Said a good meal could make the difference between a hard day and an impossible one out here." "She sounds wise," Abigail said softly. "I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you," Daniel found himself saying, surprised by the certainty he felt. "She valued courage and competence. You have both." Abigail's cheeks colored at the compliment. "Thank you." After supper, an awkwardness descended as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. They were married now, expected to share a bed, to be husband and wife in every sense. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'll bring up water for washing," he said, retreating to practical matters. "Take whatever time you need. I have a few things to finish in the barn." When he returned from his chores, having deliberately given Abigail ample privacy, he found her in their bedroom, wearing a modest white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her, this beautiful, brave woman who was now his wife, struck him with unexpected force. "I can sleep in the spare room," he offered, suddenly uncertain. "If you prefer, until we know each other better." Abigail's eyes widened slightly, but she shook her head. "We're married now. I understand what that means." Daniel approached slowly, sitting beside her on the edge of the bed. "Marriage out here is a partnership, Abigail. Equals facing the frontier together. I won't demand anything you're not ready to give." Relief softened her features. "I appreciate that, Daniel. Truly." Impulsively, he reached out to take her hand. "We have time to learn each other. There's no rush." That night, they lay side by side, a careful space between them. But as the night deepened, Abigail's breathing evened in sleep, and she unconsciously shifted closer to his warmth. Daniel lay awake, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him. He had promised to protect her, and he would, not just from physical dangers but from the loneliness that had been his constant companion these past years. The realization disturbed him. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was the price of survival, that attachment meant vulnerability, that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow. Yet here in the darkness, with this woman who had traveled across a continent to join her life with his, those certainties seemed less absolute. Sleep claimed him eventually, his last conscious thought a question he had no answer for. What if everything he believed about survival on the frontier was wrong? The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as spring bloomed across the prairie. Abigail took to ranch life with a determination that impressed Daniel. She learned to manage the household, planted an expanded garden, even insisted on learning basic ranch tasks: how to milk the cow, feed the chickens, mend fencing. "You don't need to do the outside work," Daniel had protested when he found her struggling with a broken fence post. "That's my responsibility." "We're partners, aren't we?" she'd countered. "Besides, what happens if you're injured or ill? I should know how everything works." Her practicality was difficult to argue with. Slowly, Daniel found himself sharing more of the ranch operations with her, explaining the breeding schedule for the cattle, showing her how to repair tack, teaching her to shoot his spare revolver. "I hope you never need to use it," he'd said as she practiced with cans set up on fence posts. "But out here, it's a necessary skill." Abigail had proven a quick study, her aim improving rapidly. "In Philadelphia, a lady would never touch a firearm," she'd remarked, reloading as he'd taught her. "But I'm not in Philadelphia anymore." At night, they continued to share a bed chastely, though the careful space between them had gradually diminished. Sometimes Daniel woke to find Abigail curled against him, her head on his shoulder, and those moments, before she woke and self-consciousness returned, were becoming precious to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. They learned each other's habits, preferences, histories. Daniel shared stories of his parents, of the early years on the ranch. Abigail spoke of Philadelphia, of her education, of her brother's death, though she remained vague about the circumstances, and Daniel sensed there was more she wasn't ready to reveal. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Abigail finally asked the question Daniel had been dreading. "Why did you really send for a mail-order bride, Daniel?" "The true reason." He stared out at the horizon, weighing honesty against the protective walls he'd built. "I told myself it was practical," he began slowly. "The ranch needs a woman's touch. I need help with the work. But the truth." He sighed. "I was tired of being alone, of having no one to share this with." He gestured toward the sunset, the land stretching before them. "Yet you keep yourself apart," Abigail observed gently. Even now, Daniel tensed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're kind, considerate, respectful, but you hold something back, as if you're afraid to fully connect." The accuracy of her assessment unsettled him. "The frontier takes people, Abigail. My parents. Your brother, though in a different way. Attachment just makes the loss harder when it comes." "So you'd rather not feel at all?" she challenged. "Is that truly living, Daniel?" He had no answer for her. They sat in silence until the stars emerged, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, as they prepared for bed, something had shifted between them. When Abigail emerged from behind the dressing screen in her nightgown, Daniel found himself unable to look away. The lamplight caught in her honey-blonde hair, now falling in waves down her back, and illuminated the delicate features that had grown dear to him. "You're beautiful," he said simply, the words escaping before he could censor them. Abigail's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Thank you." She approached the bed, and for the first time, she didn't immediately turn away as she slipped beneath the covers. Instead, she faced him, studying his features with an intensity that made his heart race. "I didn't expect to find what I found here," she admitted softly. "When I answered your advertisement, I was running from something, not toward anything. But now, Daniel prompted when she hesitated. "Now I find myself grateful that fate or providence brought me here. To you." Her hand reached out, tentatively touching his face. "You're a good man, Daniel Vance. Better than you believe yourself to be." The tenderness in her voice, in her touch, broke something loose inside him. Daniel closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss unlike the brief, formal one they'd shared at their wedding. This kiss held the weight of the weeks they'd spent learning each other, building trust, forming a partnership that was slowly becoming something deeper. When they finally parted, breathless, Abigail's eyes shone in the dim light. "I want to be your wife," she whispered. "In every way." That night, they truly became husband and wife, their union gentle and reverent. Afterward, as Abigail slept in his arms, Daniel felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. The truth he'd denied for so long could no longer be ignored. He was falling in love with his wife. The realization terrified him. June brought the first real test of their partnership. Daniel had ridden out at dawn to check on a section of fence that had been reported down by a neighboring rancher. By midday, when he hadn't returned, Abigail felt the first stirrings of worry. By late afternoon, her concern had deepened into dread. Daniel was never late without sending word. She paced the porch, scanning the horizon, then made a decision. Saddling Daniel's secondary horse, she'd been practicing her riding skills these past weeks. She prepared to search for him. The revolver he'd taught her to use was secured in the saddlebag, along with water and basic medical supplies. Just as she was mounting, she spotted a rider approaching. Not Daniel, but young Billy Parker from the neighboring ranch. "Mrs. Vance," he called, riding up to the house. "Mr. Vance sent me. He's been hurt, thrown from his horse when a rattler spooked it. His legs broke, I reckon. He's over by Split Rock Creek." "Is he alone?" Abigail demanded, already adjusting her course. "No, ma'am. My pa's with him. Sent me to fetch you in the wagon." Within minutes, Abigail had hitched the team to the wagon, loaded it with blankets and supplies, and was following Billy toward the location where Daniel waited. Her mind raced with everything she knew about broken bones. Her father had been a physician, and she'd often assisted him before her marriage had been arranged to James. They found Daniel propped against a boulder, his face gray with pain, his left leg stretched out at an unnatural angle. Mr. Parker had fashioned a rough splint from branches, but Daniel needed proper medical attention. "Abigail," Daniel said as she knelt beside him, relief evident in his eyes despite his pain. You shouldn't have come yourself. It's not safe. Hush, she interrupted, examining his leg with gentle hands. I'm exactly where I should be. She looked up at Mr. Parker. We need to get him into the wagon. The brake needs to be set properly. Between the three of them, Abigail, Mr. Parker, and Billy, they managed to get Daniel into the wagon bed, cushioned by blankets. Every jolt of the wagon on the way home drew a suppressed groan from Daniel, who refused laudanum until they reached the ranch. Once home, Abigail took charge. She sent Billy for the doctor in town, though she knew it might be hours before he arrived. With Mr. Parker's help, she got Daniel into the house and onto their bed. I need to set the bone before the doctor arrives, she told Daniel, mixing laudanum with water. Drink this. It will help with the pain. Daniel eyed the mixture suspiciously. How do you know how to set a bone? My father was a physician, she explained, helping him drink. I assisted him often. Now, Mr. Parker will hold you steady while I align the bone. Daniel's eyes widened slightly at this revelation about her past, but the laudanum was already taking effect. Trust you, he murmured, his eyes growing heavy. The next hour was one of the most difficult of Abigail's life. Setting the bone required strength and precision, and Daniel's muffled cries of pain tore at her heart. But when it was done, the leg properly aligned and splinted, the worst was over. Mr. Parker departed with promises to check in the next day, leaving Abigail alone with her semi-conscious husband. She bathed Daniel's face with a cool cloth, monitoring his breathing and pulse as her father had taught her. You'll be all right, she murmured, stroking his hair back from his forehead. I've got you. Daniel's eyes fluttered open briefly, clouded with laudanum, but seeking hers. You found me, he whispered. Of course I did, she replied softly. We're partners, remember? A faint smile touched his lips before he drifted off again. Abigail settled into the chair beside the bed, prepared for a long night of watching over him. The doctor arrived near midnight, examined her work, and pronounced it well done. Not much more I could have done myself, he admitted. Keep him off that leg for at least 6 weeks. No weight on it at all for the first 4. After the doctor left, Abigail continued her vigil. As dawn broke, painting the bedroom in soft golden light, Daniel awoke more fully, his eyes clear as they found hers. You've been here all night, he observed, his voice rough with sleep and lingering pain. Where else would I be? She countered gently. Daniel reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. You saved me, Abigail. Not just my leg, though the doctor said your quick action prevented complications. But out there, when I was lying injured, all I could think was that I might die without ever telling you. He trailed off, and Abigail felt her heart constrict. Telling me what? Daniel swallowed hard, then met her gaze directly. That I love you, that you've brought life back to this place, to me, in ways I never thought possible. Tears filled Abigail's eyes. I love you too, Daniel. I think I have for weeks now. He tugged gently on her hand, pulling her down to sit beside him on the bed. I thought love was a weakness out here, he confessed. Something that made survival harder. But I was wrong. It's love that gives us a reason to survive. Abigail leaned down to kiss him, her tears falling onto his cheeks. Rest now, she whispered. We have all the time in the world for this. Daniel's injury forced a transformation in their lives. With him confined to bed for weeks, then limited to crutches, the running of the ranch fell primarily to Abigail. She hired 2 local boys to help with the heavier work, but took on much of it herself, rising before dawn, tending the animals, managing the garden, all while caring for Daniel. To his credit, Daniel didn't fight her assumption of these responsibilities. Instead, he guided her with advice, taught her what she needed to know, and watched with growing admiration as his city-bred wife became a capable rancher in her own right. You're remarkable, he told her one evening as she returned from helping deliver a calf. Most women would have collapsed under the strain. Abigail smiled tiredly, washing blood and other fluids from her hands. Most women haven't had the motivation I have. The ranch? Daniel asked. She shook her head, coming to sit beside him on the porch swing where he'd stationed himself to watch the sunset. You, us, this life we're building together. As June turned to July, and July to August, Daniel's leg healed steadily. By mid-August, he was moving with only a slight limp, eager to resume his full duties. But the dynamic between them had shifted permanently. They were truly partners now, in work, in decision-making, in love. One evening as they sat on the porch, enjoying a brief respite from the summer heat, a rider approached from the direction of town. Abigail recognized him as Jim Lawrence, who worked for the territorial marshal. "Evening, Vance," Lawrence called, dismounting. "Got a message for you from Marshal Peters." Daniel stood, his stance wary. "What's happening, Jim?" Judge Wilson sent word. Blackridge's appeal on the water rights is being heard next week in the territorial court. Marshal says you should be there to represent your interests. After Lawrence departed, Daniel paced the porch, agitation evident in every movement. "If Blackridge wins this appeal, he won't," Abigail interrupted firmly. "The law is on our side." Daniel shook his head. "Law can be influenced, Abigail, especially when money's involved. Then we'll fight him. Together." She placed her hand on his arm, stilling his movement. "This is our home. I won't let him take it from us." The determination in her voice steadied him. "All right, we'll ride to the territorial capital together. It's a 3-day journey each way." The journey to Helena was arduous but uneventful. They arrived the day before the hearing, securing rooms at a modest hotel. That evening, as they dined in the hotel restaurant, Daniel noticed a well-dressed man watching them from across the room. "Don't look now," he murmured to Abigail, "but I believe Blackridge's lawyer is taking an interest in us." Abigail casually glanced over, then back to Daniel. "The man with the expensive watch chain? He looks familiar somehow." Before Daniel could respond, the man approached their table, his smile practiced and smooth. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance, I presume? Henry Wilson, representing Mr. Blackridge in tomorrow's hearing." Daniel nodded curtly. "Mr. Wilson." The lawyer's eyes lingered on Abigail, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Mrs. Vance, have we met before? You seem familiar." Abigail shook her head, though Daniel noticed her hand trembling slightly as she set down her fork. "I don't believe so, sir. I've only been in the territory since April." "Ah, perhaps you simply resemble someone I once knew. In any case, I wanted to extend an offer from my client. He's prepared to purchase your land at 3 times its market value. Without the water rights, of course." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The ranch isn't for sale at any price, Mr. Wilson." The lawyer sighed dramatically. "I feared that would be your answer. A pity. Tomorrow's hearing may not go as you hope." He turned to leave, then paused, his eyes on Abigail again. "Mrs. Vance, might I inquire where you lived before coming west?" "That's hardly relevant to our water rights dispute," Daniel cut in sharply. Of course. Merely making conversation. Good evening to you both." Wilson departed, but the unsettled feeling he left behind remained. When they returned to their room, Abigail paced nervously. "He recognized me," she said. "Or thinks he did." "From Philadelphia?" Daniel asked, watching her closely. She nodded. "He could have been one of James's associates. James knew many lawyers through his father's business." Daniel took her hands, stilling her movement. "What do you know about what happened with your brother?" Abigail's face paled. "It's possible. James's father worked tirelessly to keep the circumstances of my brother's death quiet. Ruled an accident despite the evidence of foul play." She hesitated, then continued in a rush, as if needing to finally speak the full truth. "James pushed him from a balcony after Michael confronted him about gambling debts. I witnessed it, but no one believed me. James's family had too much influence. They insisted it was an accident, that Michael had been drinking." Daniel drew her into his arms. "I'm sorry, Abigail. So sorry." She clung to him for a moment, then straightened. "If Wilson recognizes me, if he knows who I am and why I fled Philadelphia, it changes nothing about our case," Daniel assured her. "The water rights depend on land boundaries and usage laws, not on your past." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. If Wilson could somehow use Abigail's past against them, he would. The hearing the next morning began straightforwardly enough. The territorial judge, a stern-looking man named Harrison, reviewed the previous ruling, then allowed Blackridge's lawyer to present his appeal. Wilson argued that the economic benefit to the territory of Blackridge's expanded cattle operation outweighed the small-scale farming and ranching of the Vance property. When Daniel's turn came, he spoke plainly about the legalities of water rights for properties where the water source originated, citing precedents from other territories. The judge seemed attentive, even sympathetic to their position. Then Wilson requested permission to present new evidence. "Your Honor, I've recently become aware of information that bears directly on the character and credibility of the defendants." Daniel felt Abigail stiffen beside him. Proceed, Mr. Wilson, though I warn you that character evidence is rarely material in water rights disputes, Judge Harrison said skeptically. Wilson smiled thinly. I believe it is in this case, Your Honor, as it pertains to fraud. He turned to face Abigail directly. Mrs. Vance, or should I say, Miss Abigail Armstrong of Philadelphia, is it not true that you fled east under a cloud of suspicion regarding your brother's death? That you were engaged to James Welton, whose father is a prominent businessman in Philadelphia, and broke that engagement under questionable circumstances? A murmur ran through the small courtroom. Abigail's face had gone white, but her voice was steady when she answered. My name is legally Abigail Vance. My previous engagement ended before I came west. Because you were implicated in your brother's death, Wilson pressed. A death you tried to blame on your fiancée. Objection. Daniel stood, fury coursing through him. This has nothing to do with water rights. Your Honor, Wilson continued smoothly. I submit that Mrs. Vance's character is directly relevant because she and Mr. Vance have perpetrated a fraud. Their marriage is a sham, hastily arranged to strengthen Mr. Vance's claim to the land after he learned of Mr. Blackridge's appeal. Judge Harrison frowned. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Wilson. Do you have evidence? I have a telegram from Philadelphia confirming that Miss Armstrong fled under suspicious circumstances in March of this year. She arrived in Riverbed in April and was married to Mr. Vance within days. I submit this was a marriage of convenience, not legitimately contracted, and therefore their joint claim to the property should be viewed with skepticism. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but before he could speak, Abigail stood. Your Honor, may I address the court? The judge nodded, seeming curious. Abigail took a deep breath. It's true that I left Philadelphia under difficult circumstances. My brother died last year, murdered, though it was ruled an accident. I witnessed his death at the hands of James Welton, the man I was engaged to marry. When I tried to break the engagement and report what I had seen, I was threatened. So yes, I fled. The courtroom was utterly silent as she continued. I came west as a mail-order bride, answering Mr. Vance's advertisement. We were married in April by Pastor Miller of Riverbed, a legal and binding marriage witnessed and recorded properly. But what Mr. Wilson fails to understand, what perhaps few people who haven't lived on the frontier can understand, is that out here, necessity often precedes affection. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes softening. My husband and I married as strangers, yes. But in the months since, we have built something true and lasting. We've faced injury, hardship, and threats to our land together. We've become partners in every sense of the word. Abigail turned back to the judge. The creek that Mr. Blackridge seeks to claim runs through land that is legally ours. Land that we work with our own hands. Land that sustains us and that we sustain in turn. If Mr. Wilson wishes to attack my character based on events in Philadelphia, he is welcome to do so. But those events have no bearing on the legal matter before this court. A murmur of approval ran through the courtroom. Judge Harrison studied Abigail for a long moment, then nodded. Well spoken, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Wilson, unless you can demonstrate how Mrs. Vance's past specifically relates to the water rights dispute, I must agree that this line of questioning is immaterial. Wilson's face tightened with frustration. Your Honor, the legitimacy of their claim to the property has been established through proper legal channels. The judge interrupted. The marriage certificate is on record. The deed to the property is clear. Let us return to the actual matter at hand, the water rights dispute. The remainder of the hearing proceeded without further attempts to malign Abigail's character. When Judge Harrison finally rendered his decision, upholding the original ruling in favor of the Vances, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The creek, and therefore their ranch, was secure. Outside the courthouse, Daniel pulled Abigail into his arms, uncaring who might see. You were magnificent, he murmured against her hair. Absolutely magnificent. She leaned back to look up at him, her eyes shining. I told the truth. About everything. I know. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Let's go home, Abigail. Our home. The journey back to Riverbed was lighter, filled with plans for the future now that the threat to their land had been resolved. They discussed expanding the herd, building a larger barn, perhaps even hiring permanent help as the ranch grew. As they crested the final rise and their homestead came into view, Daniel reined in the wagon. The late afternoon sun bathed the buildings in golden light, the creek sparkling as it wound through their property. "It looks different somehow," Abigail remarked. "More like home," Daniel finished for her. "It looks more like home than it ever has." They rode down to the house in companionable silence, both absorbing the sight of the place they had fought so hard to keep. As Daniel helped Abigail down from the wagon, he didn't immediately release her waist. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression suddenly serious. Concern flickered across Abigail's face. "What is it?" "When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I was arranging a practical partnership. I believed that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow, that attachment only made loss more painful when it inevitably came." He took both her hands in his. "I was wrong, Abigail. So wrong. These past months have taught me that love isn't a weakness out here. It's a strength. It's what gives us the courage to face each day, to build something lasting in a harsh land." Tears gathered in Abigail's eyes as he continued. "When I saw you step off that stage with fear in your eyes, something in me recognized something in you. We were both running from loss, both afraid to trust again. But you were brave enough to take that risk, to journey across a continent to build a new life. Your courage humbled me, and continues to humble me every day." Daniel drew her closer. "I love you, Abigail Vance. Not just as my partner or my wife, but as the woman who taught me that the real frontier isn't out there." He gestured toward the vast prairie surrounding them. "But in here." He placed a hand over his heart. "The courage to love again, to build a family, to create a future despite knowing how fragile life can be." Abigail reached up to touch his face, her eyes luminous with emotion. "When I arrived that day, terrified of what awaited me, you promised to protect me. And you have, Daniel, not just from physical dangers, but from loneliness, from despair. You gave me a home when I had none." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "And I'm no longer afraid." As the sun set behind them, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson, Daniel lifted his wife into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home, not as strangers bound by necessity, but as partners united by choice, by trust, and by a love strong enough to tame the wild frontier of their hearts. Epilogue. 1 year later, the September Harvest Fair brought the scattered residents of Riverbed together in a rare communal celebration. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of pies, preserves, and late summer produce. Children darted between the legs of adults, and a small band played lively tunes that had several couples dancing in the cleared area before the church. Daniel stood at the edge of the gathering, his eyes seeking and finding Abigail among a group of women. She was laughing at something Mrs. Peterson had said, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. 6 months along now, she glowed with health and happiness. The past year had brought changes to their ranch as well. With the water rights secured, they had expanded their cattle herd and hired 2 permanent hands. The original house had been expanded to include a nursery, and Daniel had built a cradle with his own hands, using wood from the same trees his father had harvested when they first arrived in Nebraska. "She's blooming like a rose in June," Pastor Miller commented, coming to stand beside Daniel. "Your wife has brought life to more than just your homestead, son. She's become the heart of this community." Daniel nodded, watching as Abigail excused herself from the women and moved toward him, her smile widening as their eyes met. "She saved me, Pastor, in ways I didn't even know I needed saving." "That's what love does," the older man replied simply. "It saves us from ourselves." As Abigail reached them, Daniel extended his hand to her. She took it, allowing him to draw her against his side. "Are you ready to head home?" he asked. "You should rest." Abigail laughed, the sound still the sweetest music Daniel had ever heard. "I'm pregnant, not ill. But yes, I'm ready if you are." They said their goodbyes, promised Mrs. Peterson they'd consider her offer to be godparents to her newest grandchild, and made their way to their wagon. As Daniel helped Abigail up, he noticed Thomas Blackridge watching from across the fairground, his expression unreadable. Since losing the water rights case, Blackridge had been coldly civil when their paths crossed, but the threat he had posed seemed diminished. His attempt to expand had failed, and rumors suggested he was considering selling his holdings and moving further west. He still watches us like we took something that was rightfully his, Abigail remarked as Daniel climbed up beside her. He wanted what we built, Daniel replied, taking up the reins. But he never understood that it wasn't just about the land or the water. As they drove away from town, the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold, illuminating their path home. Their home, built not just of timber and nails, but of trust, courage, and a love strong enough to withstand whatever the frontier might bring. Abigail leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, her hand finding his. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when I stepped off the stage with fear in my eyes?" Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I'll protect you now," he quoted. "You have," she said softly. "And I've protected you too, in my way." "That's what partners do," he agreed, his free hand moving to rest briefly on the swell of her belly. "And soon there'll be one more person for us to protect together." As their homestead came into view, the windows glowing with welcoming light in the gathering dusk, Daniel felt a sense of completion he'd never thought possible. The frontier had taken much from him, his parents, his youth, nearly his faith in connection itself. But it had given back more than he could have imagined. A partnership founded on respect that had blossomed into deep love, a home filled with purpose, and soon, a family to carry their legacy forward. The mail-order bride who had arrived with fear in her eyes had become the courageous woman beside him, his wife, his partner, his heart. And the cowboy who had promised protection had found something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not just someone to share his burden, but someone to transform it into a blessing. Together, they had discovered the truth that had eluded them both. That even on the harsh frontier, love wasn't a luxury but a necessity, as essential to survival as water, shelter, or courage itself. And in finding that truth, they had built not just a ranch, but a life worth fighting for.